Dr. Ball, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can, Tony.
Okay. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Tony Seidel, coordinator for the Forest Health Program with South Dakota Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources, and I am your moderator today on our workshop about pine wilt disease. A little bit of housekeeping as we begin. Today's workshop is being recorded. This recording is going to be placed on the department's YouTube channel for public viewing once it is reviewed by our department's technical support team. An email will be sent to all of the registered participants, you guys, once this webinar has been uploaded. All participants' microphones and videos have been turned off upon entering. We ask you keep it that way due to bandwidth concerns. Please keep your microphone and your camera off during the presentation. The Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources is an equal opportunity provider, and we do encourage participation. There should be time at the end of this presentation for questions, a little bit of discussion, and any questions that may pop up during Dr. Ball's presentation here can be added to the chat box. Society of American Forester and International Society of Arboriculture continuing education credits are available for attending this live workshop. One thing that will help me greatly in determining who is here and who is not from the registration list is if you go to your participation or participants list and make sure your name reads as the name that you're registered with. I have some strange ones on there right now, like Avenius and owner and things like that. So if you could please, participants, double check your name. Make sure if you hover over your name, you hit more, you can rename your participant name. That'll help us make sure you get those credits that you're here to receive. If you have not included your credentials for either of those certifications, please do so in the chat box now. This workshop is a second in a series of virtual presentations focused on forest health in South Dakota. Our goal is to inform landowners and decision makers on the current and local dendrological trends. We are glad you can join us today for our presentation about pine wilt disease. Now, since its confirmation in Southeast South Dakota in 1983, we've seen a progressive trend northward of pine wilt disease. Recent confirmations in Brown and Perkin counties confirm a nearly statewide presence of this disease in just 40 years' time. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. John Ball, South Dakota Forest Health Specialist and SDSU Professor and Extension Forester, who will discuss how and why pine wilt disease impacts South Dakota trees, as well as the management practices mitigate effects on our resources. And with that, I turn it over to you, Dr. Ball.
All right, thank you, Tony. And Tony's going to be kind of monitoring the chat since I won't see it. We're also getting some feedback, Tony, from somebody. So I'm not sure if somebody else is still out there. But now we're getting a lot of feedback. Anyway, thank you, everyone, for attending. And this won't take the hour, but it'll go as long as it needs to answer your questions as well. But I've got a PowerPoint that's going to cover, a little bit of the history, then what are the symptoms, why is it a problem now, what we can do in terms of management, and then how to send a sample in if you think your tree might be infected. So let's get started. Actually, the disease really was first noted in 1905 in Nagasaki, Japan. What they found is at the very southern end of their main island there that they were losing pine trees, and they were losing a lot of pine trees. And in that time, it actually ended up now moving up, and it's throughout a lot of the area. It was first described, let me shut this off. It was first described in Japan as a nematode in 1972. So in other words, they noticed a lot of dying pine trees and they gave it a name, but they didn't know what was the causal agent. In fact, they looked at a lot of borers and that as possibilities. But then they found this little nematode. And again, nematodes are microscopic. So the fact that they didn't see it is not too much of a surprise. But they were able to associate that with the heavy losses of the Japanese pines, and they named it pine wilt disease. Again, the first indication of this, the first time they saw it was 1905 down in the Southern Islands. And then by 1930, it was in the main island, Honshu, and it gradually moved northward. Now, again, they tried doing a lot of cutting, and obviously during the Second World War, nothing was done, and it spread fairly rapidly. And then it was up in the northern island by 1990. Now, Hokkaido doesn't really have an issue with it. And there's a reason for that, and we're going to chat about that a little bit later. Now, it was first isolated in the United States at the University of Missouri in 1979. In fact, the story goes that they were doing the plant clinic there. People could bring in samples, what's wrong with my tree question. And someone brought in one, and someone said, that looks like pine wilt, a disease that's just killing pines by the millions in Japan. And they went through, found the nematode, and oh my goodness, the world came to an end, because now a organism responsible for the loss of millions of pines was found in the heartland of the United States. And the articles that came out, in fact, I was taking a nemacology class as part of my PhD at the time. It was amazing. They were looking at, we're going to lose all our pines. We're going to lose our ponderosa pines, our white pines, all this. And of course, everybody was extremely concerned about this. And there was an awful lot of work done initially on it. But then they noticed the disease was present on introduced pines in the United States, not on our native pines. In fact, as they noticed declining trees in the Missouri area, what they noticed was it was the Scots pines. It was the Austrian pines. It was not any of the native pines. And by native, I mean native to the United States. If you planted a ponderosa pine down there, it really wasn't affected. And by the way, this is a very common way of just eyeballing this disease. I've been out in a number of belts where they have Austrian pines and ponderosa pines. And if all the Austrian pines look like these, picture I took in Huron, but the ponderosa pines seem absolutely fine, that's a pretty good indication that the problem's pine wilt disease. I mean, if they're all affected, then it must be some environmental factor, drought, for example. But if just the introduced trees, the Scots pines or the Austrian pines, are affected, and any ponderosa pine standing nearby or not, well, that's going to kind of lead you to this. So once they figured out that, wait a minute, this was really a problem on the introduced pines, it was not so much a threat on our native pines, things kind of settled down, and they started doing more checking. And lo and behold, they found that this was actually first described way back in 1934. It was collected from longleaf pines in Louisiana and Texas. So what they found is that this was a native nematode, which makes absolute sense. If the nematode is killing the exotic pines, it's probably native here. If it were killing our native pines, then that would mean the nematode was probably introduced, because trees tend to have tolerance or some degree of resistance to pests that they co-evolved with. And so here it kind of like, okay, this is native. So it's our exotic pines that are going to be affected. And as they've looked around over the years, it's native in the United States. Now, that dot in the United States doesn't mean that it's only found in Minnesota. In fact, if you look at it, it's really native in the Midwest, from about Indiana to Colorado, from South Dakota all the way down to Kansas, and a little bit of Oklahoma. So that's kind of the hot spot in the center of the country. It was first, again, identified in Japan, Southern Island, and then has moved up. But notice too, they've now found it Korea, throughout China, or let's say spots in China, Spain, Finland, it was actually found as well, and Nigeria. So it's popping up all these places. Now, again, the Finnish one is not on here because of some other issues we'll discuss a little bit later on as well. But one thing I want you to notice is, if you look at this map and you look at where this nematode is now established and killing their native pines, notice they're kind of along the warmer areas of the globe. And if you look in South Dakota, going back through the records before I came here, the first tree that was identified as being with pine wilt was down in the Yankton area in 1983, I believe. And then I have a report that they found one in Custer, but it was just eyeballed. Someone looked at a tree, one of our foresters looked at a tree at the time, I don't have his name, and said, well, the way this tree's dying, and it was a Scots pine, that might be pine wilt. Then I came here in the early 90s, and I remember I ended up going out to Bennett County. And I was called out there by the county educator, and they said, well, someone's concerned about losing their pines. And I stood there and I noticed that the Scots pines were dying, and Scott pine does extremely well down there, but all the ponderosas looks absolutely fine. And it reminded me of what I'd seen in Michigan when we first started dealing with pine wilt disease. And so I collected samples, because that's the only way to really know, and brought samples back. And Jim Smolik, our nematologist, was still on staff. And we went through, and lo and behold, we found it was pine wilt disease caused by the pinewood nematode. And you'll notice the dots start lining up there towards the bottom of the state. And then it keeps going farther and farther and farther north until this last year, 2021, we found it in Perkins County, Brown County. There was another one in Day County, found one in Edmonds County now. And that, so we're really at the northern border. They have not confirmed it yet in North Dakota. And back in the early 80s, it was found in southern Minnesota, but not any farther north than that. And there's a reason for that, which we'll chat about. But there's the three that found this one out in Perkins County. And it's a Scots pine tree, which again does very well in our state. It's well adapted to our climate. But you could take a look at the row and you can see the trees in the background. They are just going or have already gone. The point here is, no matter where you live in South Dakota, this nematode is most likely present. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to kill all the trees. We still have Scots pines and Austrian pines down in Yankton, for example. But it just means you have a higher risk that your particular tree or trees in your belt may be affected. So at this point, planting Scots pines or Austrian pines, well, you got to consider the fact that they may be on a short term. They're going to have a real short shelf life. Well, what are the symptoms of the disease? How would you be able to know that your tree has it, for example? Well, first of all, if it has it, you'll know it because it's all going to happen in a year. Anyone that calls and says, well, I've had this tree slowly decline over the years, the likelihood it is not pine wilt disease. It tends to go fairly quickly through a tree. Take a look at this. These are two Austrian pines at the Arboretum in Spearfish, South Dakota. And in midsummer, one of the two trees had the needles go from a faded green, went light brown, and now you can see they're kind of bleached out and graying. And sure enough, by that fall, look at it. Now it went from green to brown, from live to dead in about 3 months. And that's a fairly common pattern. You know, again, if someone calls me in fall and says, you know, I have a pine tree, it looked perfect this spring, and now it's dead, it's a pretty good indication that it may be pine wilt disease. And it goes that fast. And of course, the tree was taken down and the other tree's still there. Now, the interesting thing with this disease and this nematode is this is a very common pattern. If you ever see it in a shelter belt, it doesn't just start at one end and just take them off all the way down. It'll be random throughout the belt. And you'll lose one here, 5 here, 3 there, 1 here, back and forth, until eventually the entire belt is killed. But it's not overnight, and different trees will be affected each year and they'll be killed that year. But it can take a decade or more before it goes through an entire shelter belt. So it's fast acting on the individual tree, slow acting over an entire belt or a town. As I mentioned, we've had it down in Yankton for almost 40 years, and there's still some pretty nice Scots pines down there that haven't been affected. But even those, you know, you drive by, well, another one's gone because of the disease. If you're really looking carefully, you can often see the disease start on a single branch. And if you notice here on the Scots pine, I took that picture, I think 2 years ago in Yankton. This is in early summer, and one branch on the Scots pine is discolored. And they noticed that. They said, well, this one branch just doesn't seem right. Well, that kind of looks like pine wilt. And at that point, once it's infected, there's nothing you're going to do to stop it. So 3 months later, that's what the tree looked like. Like I said, they can go that quickly. Now, occasionally, what you'll notice, particularly on Austrian pines, is that you'll see the branch occur in the fall, and then in the spring the whole tree will go, or it'll go that next year. Occasionally we see it take 2 years on an Austrian pine to finish the tree off. But like I say, you look, you'll find one branch, and that branch is a start, and then it just very quickly spreads throughout the entire tree during the hot summer, and we lose the whole tree, usually by fall. And by fall too, if you grab that branch, it snaps right off. The needles will just fall. They can wilted, hence the name pine wilt disease, but it just breaks right off. And if you fell the tree during the winter time, you'll notice those blue streaks in the wood. The blue streaks aren't from the nematode. It's actually a blue stain fungus. Some of you might remember that as being part of the problem with mountain pine beetle in the Black Hills. It would carry pine wilt disease, or excuse me, it would carry blue stain fungus, sorry. And that blue stain fungus would also contribute to the decline of the tree. Well, in this case, very similar. The Sawyer beetles carry in the nematode into the tree, and they also carry a blue stain fungus into it. And the fungus helps contribute to the decline, and the blue stain fungus serves as a food source for the nematode as well. The other thing too, when you cut these trees down, you'll find that wood is incredibly light. That's again another one of our clues. Somebody says, my pine tree died very quickly, usually within a few months. In the fall of the year, needles are just hanging there. They cut the tree down and they find this blue and streaks throughout the sapwood. And also the wood is dry as dust. Literally, you can pick up large pieces and there's no sap. And on pines, that's pretty surprising, as you would expect. You grab the wood, you break a branch, you're going to have sticky hands. No, because the little nematode interferes with the resin ducts on the tree and essentially plugs everything up. So the tree dries up, essentially desiccates it like a Pringles potato chip. If it's still heavy and wet, that is not pine wilt disease. As I mentioned, the nematode is carried from tree to tree by Sawyer beetles, and there's occasionally some other insects as well. There are 3 primary vectors. There's a couple of others as well, but white spotted Sawyer, pine Sawyer is fairly common in the area. Carolina and Southern, surprising their names, can be found. They can be found in North Dakota as well. But nevertheless, we take a look at the white spotted and white Sawyer, pine Sawyers as being really the primary vectors in South Dakota. Now, this beetle tends to go for declining trees, but it will also just feed on healthy trees. There's the larvae to this insect. Fairly large, looks like a big white grub beneath the bark. As this is finishing up its development, it actually is an attractant to the nematodes. The nematodes will cluster around it as it pupates. And then in the spring and summer, when the Sawyer beetles emerge, they carry the nematode in the tracheids. And they can literally carry thousands, or they can carry a few, or they might carry none. Transmission is not assured. It can happen in just a couple of percentages, and that's about it. But the spiracles, which are essentially the breathing tubes for insects, think of them as a row of noses. That's how they'll enter and are going to be transported. And then as a Sawyer beetle lands on another tree and starts burrowing in, they're going to release those nematodes, and usually they're egg niches. They're going to chew out just a little piece of bark there to put their eggs, and that wound is what the nematode can enter. It can also enter just by nibbling on the needles. Now think of that. All the Sawyer beetle has to do is come up and just nibble on the needles, and that's enough of a wound that some of the nematodes can enter it. Now think of that. Think of the odds, the combination of events that have to occur. And that's why it just doesn't move down a line very quickly. It kind of hits scattered ones. One might become infected, the next tree may not. So finding those egg niches, which looks to me like a Phillips screwdriver stabbed into the tree, is one indication that the Sawyer beetles have visited that tree. You're not going to see anything with the needles. They might have just stopped by for a quick snack on their way to another tree, but both means are very common to release the nematodes into a new host. A couple of other things with it. Apparently the Sawyer beetles aren't after young trees. Usually they have to be greater than about 10 years old, or maybe 10 to 12 feet tall, before they're really at risk. Occasionally I find a younger tree infested. When I worked in Michigan, Christmas tree growers, which grew lots of Scots pines, weren't really affected by the pine wilt disease. It's the mature trees. And here's a perfect example. Down at Lewis and Clark, we have some larger Scots pines in there that are already beginning to fade, and some large Austrians, and yet the small ones all look pretty good. And again, that will be another clue you might be able to use. Hey, the smaller pines look good. It's the larger pines that are being affected. The other thing you'll notice is Sawyer beetles like sun. And so what they'll do is take out the trees at the edges. This is a Scots pine block up at the Big Sioux Nursery. And you'll notice it just kind of plows through it. And if you walked in there, you'd find a couple hit, but not that many. They tend to like the edges. And one of my best examples, and some of you may have seen it as well, is that beautiful, what used to be beautiful, Scots pine grove that's right along I-29 near the Del Rapids exit. And about 3 years ago, I started noticing some of the trees declining from pine wilt. And if you look carefully, but keep your eyes on the road, you'll find that the ones at the outer edge have been affected. And as they're being affected and killed and more sunlight penetrates, it's going deeper in and will go throughout there. And eventually, I'm certain that we'll be driving by this 3 years from now. It'll be all the trees will be standing dead. So what ones are susceptible to pine wilt disease? Let's go over the big ones here. You're looking again at a Scots pine planting at Big Sioux Nursery, and regardless of seed sources, it's just taking them out. So Scots pines is the most common host for pine wilt disease. It's the tree that's most often killed. If you go into a community, the first ones that seem to go are the Scots pines. Scots pine is a very common tree. I can find it throughout the state, from Hardin County all the way down to Union County and across to Roberts down to Fall River. Does very well in our state. Has kind of this orange bark near the top, very noticeable. And then the trunk is fissured in these irregular plates. It's kind of an attractive bark, but like I say, that orange is very common with Scots pines. And when someone says, well, my tree died very quickly, just a couple of months. Well, what's the bark look like? Is it kind of orange? Well, yeah. Well, okay, that was a Scots pine. On Scots pines, the needles are only in twos, and they're short and typically bluish green. So blue-green, maybe twist a little bit, but they're always in twos. And they also have a fairly small cone, about 1 to 3 inches long, with a bump at the end of each scale. This is the most common host, and you tend to find these go before many of the other trees. The other tree, and as I say, sometimes you'll know Scots pines going, and then the Austrian pines will start to die. Not always. But Austrian pine has also been planted throughout the state. It's a tough tree, tolerates drought, seems to adapt it to our conditions. The bark here is kind of gray-brown and these flattened plates. Actually, the bark is rather pretty. It's a much lighter color than you'll find with a lot of other trees. The needles are also in twos and pairs, but they're longer, about 3 to 5 inches long. And the way you can tell too is if you tap your open palm onto the end, it'll hurt. The needles don't bend very well. They're extremely stiff, and these will be dark green. Cones are about 2 to 3 inches and a little prickle at the tip of each scale. You have to really grab it to feel it, but there'll just be this little pinprick on it. And then surprisingly, mugo pine. Now, these are all exotic pines. They're not native to North America. And it has to be a fairly large mugo pine because the small ones aren't apparently attractive to the Sawyer beetles, or at least we don't see the disease develop in them very often. But we have some big mugo pines across state too. There's one bigger than the house up at Mobridge, for example. And here's a fairly large one at SDSU. Has kind of a brownish gray bark, and it's very scaly on these larger mugo pines. And the needles are also in twos. Cones are about 1 to 2 inches long. But again, two needle pines, as you're noticing, are fairly common. Now, by the way, on the picture I took of this tree, you'll see all those white dots on the needles. That has nothing to do with pine wilt. This tree just has a bad infestation of pine needle scale. But what about our native pines, ponderosa? Don't worry about them. They do fine. And how do we identify a ponderosa pine? Well, it has this brown black furled bark. It's a little more scaly, smaller plates than what you'll find on the Austrian pines and what you'll find on the Scots pines, nor will you get that orange coloration near the top. The other thing, the needles are in twos or threes in this case. You can find trees with all twos, you can find trees with all threes, you can find trees with a combination of both. But take a look at the needle length, about 5 to 9 inches. So generally speaking, the needles are going to be longer than any of the other pines that we have. And they can go from a medium to dark green to even a yellow green. And the cones are larger, about 3 to 6 inches, and they have a stout prickle at the end. You pick them up kind of palm size, and you can feel that little prickle at the end of them. Now, I mention this tree not because it's susceptible, just because it's fairly common pine. And if you're looking for a pine to put in your windbreaks, this is probably where you're going in the future, because I don't see us planting Scots pines and Austrian pines much longer, considering the fact that pine wilt disease is now throughout the entire state. And eastern white pine. Now, it's not native here, and we grow it a little bit on the eastern end of the state, but it is a native pine, native to North America. And the bark here is kind of a smooth gray green to it, and that rather attractive, but the needles are soft and they're in fives. So that separates them out fairly well. We can find the nematode and occasionally pine wilt disease in stressed white pines. By that, they're not drought tolerant. So if they're beginning to decline, sometimes pine wilt disease will affect them. And of course, we do have some other pines in the state. We planted Korean pine, we planted Swiss pine. We've got a number of others, but I just want you to remember this. If the pine is native outside of North America, most likely it's a suitable host, and most likely it'll be killed by pine wilt disease. If it's native to North America, particularly somewhere in this greater central part of the country, you're going to find very low susceptibility, very high tolerance to it. Now, by the way, the nematode can be pulled out of spruce, firs, larch, but it doesn't develop into pine wilt disease. So the nematode is kind of ubiquitous around, but it only affects certain trees, and that is our exotic pines. Well, as I mentioned, take a look at that pattern again, but one of the things you might be thinking about is, well, wait a minute. If the nematode's native to North America, and we've been planting Scots pines and Austrian pines forever, and they've always been up and down the state, how come it just started affecting now? And how come we have this spread pattern? You know, why did it first get down into Yankton County and then move its way up? Well, here's the interesting connection. There's probably a lot of reasons, but a big one that people look at is our warmer summers. Interesting enough, you can find the nematode in trees, but it will not present as pine wilt disease unless your summers are warm enough. Remember back to Hokkaido, the northern island, Japan, it's cooler. So they've seen very little pine wilt because the summers really aren't warm enough. And that's what we're finding in a lot of areas, that if it's not warm enough, you're not going to see the disease, despite the fact the nematode may be present. Well, what do we need? Ideally, for this to develop, we need more than 55 days with a mean temperature above 76 degrees. So 55 days with a mean temperature above 76 degrees, or a mean summer temperature of about 70 degrees or higher. Now you might think, well, that doesn't seem that hot. When we start looking at averages, it has to be pretty warm in order to get that, because our nights tend to be a little bit cooler. And I mapped out Aberdeen, South Dakota, and I just picked 2 years. But I want you to take a look at June in 2020 and June of 1990. And that dashed line going across is that threshold of 76 degrees. And if you look in June of 1990, barely got that warm as an average. And then look how many days in June hit that as an average, not as a maximum, but as an average in 2020. And that's June. Here's July. Notice the same thing, that back in 1990, we barely hit it, where we're hitting it more consistently in 2020 and even into August. And so as you start looking at the temperatures in our state, our summers have gradually getting warmer. They were always warm enough down in Yankton. By that, I mean at least within 1980 when we first found it. And so as our summers are getting warmer and drier, we're seeing this problem more and more. If we went into a cooler 10 years, you would find the disease just slows down and maybe comes to a stop. But if the forecast is warmer and drier, expect to see more of this throughout the entire state. And quite frankly, if you listen to Laura Edwards, our climatologist, that's what we're anticipating. And if you just look at the averages, it's been slowly getting warmer during our summers over the past couple of decades. Well, how do you confirm the tree has pine wilt disease? You know, here's one on campus. Now, this was an Austrian pine, and we noticed 1 or 2 branches fading. You notice that near the bottom? Now, by the way, there's no law saying a tree can only have one problem. And this tree also had Diplodia tip blight. But we noticed 1 branch beginning to go, and then more branch starting to go by the time we hit midsummer. In fact, the ground was being covered with falling needles that were coming off so much. We cut the tree down, dry. There was that blue staining, and we did send it in, or we did check it to make sure it had pine wilt disease, the nematode present, and it did. But we do have other issues out there. Diplodia tip blight. Now, Diplodia tip blight is a fungus disease of the growing tips. And you can see here how individual tips have died. The other thing you'll notice with this, the top of the tree is still green. With the Diplodia tip blight, the top remains green, and we'll find the disease going throughout. If it's if it's pine wilt disease, it really starts at the top because the tree is really desiccating. So that's going to be first affected, and then it goes in from there. Now, again, here you'll notice just dead tips. The needles behind it will be fine, but eventually, and this will take several years of this disease, you'll find just hanging needles. And we can isolate the fungus for that and identify it by the spores if needed. Might mention too, we do have some insects. Pine tortoise scale. I took this picture up in Aberdeen on a Scots pine. But notice here it's kind of yellowing and thinning throughout. You've got some green needles as well. And if you look close on it, you would find those bumps, and that's pine tortoise scale that's affecting it. So not every discoloration on a pine means we're dealing with pine wilt disease. And again, both these tend to be chronic problems. The tree has it year after year after year rather than it dies very quickly. So how about sampling? How do we do that? Well, if you need to know if the tree is dying from pine wilt, and again, once it begins to decline from pine wilt, there is nothing you can do to save it. So your interest might be, oh, is this pine wilt? Do I need to be worried about my other Scots pines or Austrian pines? We often take sampling, our foresters, by that I mean our foresters in the department, with an increment bore. Now, increment bores are not always the best or easiest because the nematode isn't evenly distributed throughout the entire trunk. So you might be able to miss columns of these that are inside the tree, but nevertheless, we've had pretty good success with it. We use a 3/16 inch diameter increment bore, and we'll bore inside into the tree. You only need about a 2-inch core, and that's it. Now, just by looking at this one, and I did this one a day ago, I would look at it and say, you know what, either I missed it or this tree doesn't have pine wilt disease. And the reason being, there's no blue in this. Now, I'm not saying you have to have blue in order to find the nematode in this, but it's a lot easier. If it's blued and it's dry, if you touch that core and it's still moist, probably not. If it's blued and dry, that's a pretty good indication we're going to find the nematode in that sample. But again, just the outer 2 inches, that's all I need. You can also use a ship's auger. Here, it's a little bit more complicated. You're now trying to pull all the sawdust that's coming out of that and put that in a bag. But they can be used in all the wood chips collected, but try to put a bag right underneath there and collect it. You're not going to be able to sweep them up from the ground, or you'll be sweeping up too much other dust and we'll probably not find the nematode in it. And if whether you're going to drill or core with an increment bore, you want to do it near a whorl where a lot of the branches are connected along the lower trunk. And trunk is a lot better than branches. Sometimes we've had to take a sample from a branch, but again, we can end up taking samples and not find the nematode because we missed it. But nevertheless, the tree has the nematode in it, and the reason it's dying is pine wilt disease. A reminder, the nematode can be transmitted by us as well. So when you've collected that sample, before you move to another tree and collect another sample, absolutely clean it. You can use Pine Sol, you can use bleach. I recommend using Pine Sol and then let it dry. The nematode can't live on a dried surface. So if I clean that increment bore or clean the ship's auger, dry it out, let it sit in the sun, use it the next day, I'm fine. What you don't want is drilling into a tree and you still have all that little dust to it. Take the increment bore and go right to the next tree and do it. If the first tree had the nematode, the second one's going to have it now. The other, some people send us cookies. Not the cookies we want to eat, but cookies meaning a cross section of the trunk. Now, obviously, that's a little bulkier to send, but it's usually easier to get the nematode out of because we have an entire cross section. About 1 inch thick is all we need. Again, cutting it from the lower whorls. Now, obviously here, you're doing this on a tree that's pretty much near dead. And you're not wondering if the tree has it because you're hoping it comes back. You're doing it because you're pretty sure this is a nematode, but you want to know because you have other Scots pines or Austrian pines that you're concerned about. But cookies work. Again, it has to be from a tree that is dying, all right, rather than one that's been standing dead for a couple of years. And when you cut it, it still should have those blue streaks in it and the wood will be dry. Place them in a plastic bag. Now, some do recommend adding a wet paper towel because we've got to keep the tissue moist. If you set it on your dashboard for a couple of days and it dries out, the nematodes are dead. But I recommend putting it in a refrigerator until you're going to ship it and send it overnight. 2 days business would be best rather than snail mail. And if you add a damp paper towel in there, you know what often happens? We just get a lot of mold, and it's very difficult to see anything in that mold. So I would prefer it to be dry, but I'd also prefer that it be kept in your refrigerator until you send it, and then send it so it's going to arrive here at SDSU within 2 days. Here's where you send everything to. It's the SDSU Plant Diagnostic Clinic. Connie Tandy is the manager of this. She works with this a lot, does fantastic work, I might mention, on this and our other samples as well. That website there is where you can get the sample submission form, fill it out. The basic fees for extracting the nematodes, in-state samples $35, out-of-state is $45. Now, if I'm doing it as part of my diagnostic work, or one of our foresters is doing it as their part of their diagnostic work, there's generally not a charge. However, if you mail it in, make sure you're following everything on that sheet, because there is a $35 fee for those in-state, and out-of-state $45. And if you say, well, when the foresters come out and check all my trees, we're not likely to do that either. We're doing it for diagnostics. Are we finding it now in this area rather than just finding it in every tree? I might also suggest that you call or text maybe. And the reason for that is I might say, hey, send me a picture. Let's see if the symptoms are enough that you need to check it. Or I might say, you know what, I'll drive by and take a look. Or we might have one of our foresters drive by and take a look. There's no point in you sending a sample in if it doesn't have the right symptoms. When we get the sample, by the way, when Connie pulls everything apart here and we put it in our refrigerator, the chips or cores are soaked in water. Again, we're going to get the nematode coming out of them this way. And then it's going to be looked at under a microscope, and it has to be identified, because you know what? There's more than just this one nematode in a tree. You can find nematodes in a lot of trees. They can be algae feeders. They can be feeding on a lot of different things. And there's a lot of close lookalikes. So it isn't just, did we find a nematode? It's, did we find the right nematode? And there are keys to go through and identify this, and it's certainly not something homeowners are going to do at all, and not a lot of other people either. It's pretty much a science to be able to identify it, and there are other tests that can be done that some other states do to determine whether or not the nematode was there. But again, if the tree dies very quickly, it's Scots pine, most likely it did die of pine wilt. But there's a lot of times it's handy to know if that tree did die of it, so you can figure out what you're going to do with your surrounding pine trees. And that gets us to the last part, management of the disease. Okay, you went out and cut down a bunch of pine trees. You notice that blue stain in them. You sent a sample in and we said, yes, pine wood nematode was present in the sample. Those trees died of pine wilt. What are you going to do for the other pines? Well, first of all, don't leave dead infested trees. Too often I go out to a belt like this and you can see some of those trees have been standing for quite some time there. We do have some spruce in here as well that are dying, but if you'll notice, there's an awful lot of dying pine in there. And that because they've been slowly going from pine wilt disease, the pines, not the spruce. Biggest thing is cut those trees down right now, this time of year. Any tree that died last fall, get rid of them now. And the best is burn them. Now, again, we have some issues with burning right now. It's so dry. But I can give you some real horror stories where people went out, cut down their infested trees, hauled all the wood over to a grove of healthy Scots pines, and then the next year were calling me because that grove was declining. You know, the recommendations are bury the wood, burn the wood. If you just debark it, you're not going to eliminate the Sawyer beetles because they're coming out. Ideally, we'd like all that work done by April 1st. Now, I'll tell you, quite often, they're not flying until early May, or in the northern part of our state, late May. But the point is, what you're trying to do is your tree that's now dead, this spring, the Sawyer beetles are going to leave that tree, fly to other trees, and maybe carrying the nematodes with them. So we want to get rid of that wood over the winter before spring, so that we're not going to have the nematodes leave it. And again, this is where you have to have cooperation among neighbors. If you got adjacent shelter belts and you're doing everything right and the neighbor isn't, you're going to find you're going to lose them quicker. The other is if you chip. Just to be safe, fresh chips should not be placed around pine trees, not if the chips came from infested pines. They have found the nematode can survive for 3 months in chips, particularly if the chips are fairly deep, so they stay moist. And if there's a wound at the base of the tree on the root flare, the nematodes can move in. Now, I'll admit that takes a lot to have it happen, but there have been documentation of transmission through chips. And for those that say, John, I have a real valuable Scots pine in my yard, and we have some beauties out there. What can I do? Well, you can hire someone, and that's the key here. This requires a commercial applicator. There's nothing you can buy from the store that's really going to adequately protect these. So you need to call a company that does treat pines for pine wilt disease. And they're either going to come out and inject it now at this time of year. And by now, for us, a little bit later in April's fine, and even early May, because the Sawyer beetles haven't really left yet, or they're going to inject a tree in the fall. And the big three are ArborJet, Arbor Systems, or Rainbow, and Rainbow has a Q system. The other two have a system where it's injected directly in with their apparatus, where Rainbow, they put tubes all the way around typically. ArborJet does, but they have a plug that goes into it. This will provide about 2 years of protection, but I want you to know you can only inject trees without symptoms. Once a tree is showing symptoms, once the tree is infected, the treatments do not work. So the treatments have to be done fairly often, every 2 years. They have to be done on trees that are not showing any symptoms in order to work. And I'll tell you, the range of success that I've seen is anywhere from 60 to 90%. Seems like the larger trees, it doesn't work as well as the smaller trees, but the real problem is some trees can have the nematodes for maybe a year before they start showing any symptoms. Maybe there's just one branch up there that declined. Well, someone goes out and injects it thinking it's a perfectly healthy tree, a tree without symptoms, yet it did have symptoms. And so the tree faded. So unlike the treatments we have for Dutch elm disease or the treatments we have for emerald ash borer that are in the 97, 98% success, this is less. It doesn't mean not to do it. Didn't say that at all, but just don't expect it to work as well as the other treatments have. But there are people out there treating their trees because, let's face it, if you got a huge Scots pine out there, it's probably worth protecting. Might add too, as I'm closing here, that I do offer a tree pest alert that is available through the South Dakota Department of Ag Natural Resources website and through our extension website. It'll keep you up to date on things that are going around from week to week. We just went to weekly because the season is progressing. And in that, you'll find, well, what's going on right now. And unfortunately, this year, you'll probably see a lot of samples for pine wilt. So with that, I appreciate everybody listening. I hope it was quiet for you. There is some background noise in my office. Apparently, they've just decided to tear the office one floor below me apart. I was not aware of that. I apologize if you're hearing drilling in the background, but hopefully my voice was clear. But there's where I can be reached, john.ball@sdstate.edu, or my cell, which again, I get a lot of people just texting me pictures, and feel free to do that as well. But at this point, I'll turn it over to Tony, and he can let me know if we've got any questions in the chat box.